The year was 1603, and England held its breath as news spread through cobblestone streets and castle corridors alike. The Virgin Queen was dead. Elizabeth I, the woman who had defied Spanish armadas and papal bulls, who had transformed England from a fractured kingdom into a formidable empire, lay still in Richmond Palace. But what happened in the hours after her death would remain hidden for centuries, buried beneath layers of royal protocol and political necessity. Picture this scene for a moment. 3 men stand in a dimly lit chamber, their faces pale in the flickering candlelight. They are bound by oaths more sacred than marriage vows, sworn to absolute secrecy about what they are about to witness. As they begin the solemn task of preparing England's greatest monarch for her final rest, they uncover something so shocking, so politically explosive, that it threatens to unravel the very foundations of the Tudor dynasty. What those men discovered that night was not simply the body of an elderly queen who had succumbed to natural causes. It was evidence of a deception so profound, so carefully orchestrated, that it had fooled an entire nation for nearly half a century. The Virgin Queen, England's symbol of divine favour and Protestant virtue, carried secrets beneath her elaborate gowns and painted face that would have toppled governments and rewritten history books. Today, over 400 years later, those secrets remain locked away beneath Westminster Abbey, sealed in lead and silence. The Church of England has refused every request for scientific examination, every plea from historians and forensic experts who believe modern technology could finally reveal the truth. Why such fierce protection of a monarch's remains? What could possibly be so dangerous that it must remain hidden even now, in an age of DNA analysis and advanced medical understanding? The answer lies not just in what Elizabeth was, but in what she represented. She was more than flesh and blood. She was the living embodiment of England's destiny, the proof that God favoured Protestant rule over Catholic tyranny. To admit that her body harboured dark secrets would have been to admit that the entire English Reformation was built upon a lie. But let's start at the beginning, because the story of Elizabeth's final secret begins long before her death. It begins with a young princess who learned early that survival in the Tudor court required transformation into something beyond ordinary mortality. Elizabeth Tudor entered the world on September 7th, 1533, at Greenwich Palace. Her birth was supposed to herald a new golden age for England. Her father, Henry VIII, had broken with Rome itself to marry her mother, Anne Boleyn. He had declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, all for the promise of a male heir that Anne carried in her womb. Instead, he got Elizabeth, a daughter who would prove more valuable than any son, though he could never have imagined it at the time. The disappointment was crushing. Henry had upended the religious landscape of Europe for a boy who never came. Within 3 years, Anne Boleyn would lose her head on Tower Green, executed on charges that most historians now agree were fabricated. Little Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, watched her world collapse. One day she was a princess, heir to the throne of England. The next, she was declared illegitimate. Her mother branded a traitor and adulteress. This early trauma would shape everything that followed. Elizabeth learned that in the Tudor court, women's bodies were battlegrounds where dynasties rose and fell. She watched her father cycle through wives like playing cards, discarding Catherine of Aragon, executing Anne Boleyn, mourning Jane Seymour, divorcing Anne of Cleves, beheading Catherine Howard, and finally, outliving Catherine Parr. Each woman's fate hinged on her ability to produce sons, to transform her flesh into vessels for male heirs. The lesson was clear and terrifying. A woman's body was simultaneously her greatest asset and her most dangerous vulnerability. Elizabeth would spend her entire life ensuring that hers could never be used against her. By the time she reached adolescence, Elizabeth had already begun the physical transformation that would define her reign. she started applying the white lead makeup that would become her signature, layers of Venetian ceruse mixed with vinegar that created the pale, otherworldly complexion she believed symbolized virginal purity. What she didn't understand was that she was slowly poisoning herself with every application. The lead seeped through her skin day after day, accumulating in her bones and organs. It would cause tremors in her hands, blacken her teeth, and create the mood swings and erratic behavior that would puzzle her courtiers for decades. But in the beginning, it simply made her look ethereal, untouchable, almost divine. She also began wearing the extreme corsets that would shape her silhouette into the iconic image we recognize today. These weren't merely fashion statements. They were instruments of transformation, reinforced with whalebone and steel, laced so tightly that servants had to brace their feet against her back to achieve the desired effect. The pressure often exceeded 80 pounds per square inch, enough to crack ribs and displace organs. But perhaps most importantly, Elizabeth began cultivating the persona of the Virgin Queen long before she actually took the throne. She understood instinctively that her unmarried state could be a source of power rather than weakness. While other women were defined by their relationships to men, she would be defined by her relationship to England itself. When she finally became queen in 1558 at age 25, Elizabeth had already spent years perfecting the illusion of divine femininity. Her coronation portrait shows a young woman with porcelain skin, delicate features, and an otherworldly glow. She looks more like a saint than a monarch, which was precisely the effect she intended. What the portrait doesn't show is what was happening beneath the surface. Even in her 20s, Elizabeth was experiencing mysterious health problems that she kept carefully hidden from public view. Court physicians wrote in coded Latin about treatments for unusual symptoms, about conditions they had never encountered before. They described finding tissue configurations that defied their understanding of female anatomy. These early medical mysteries would only deepen as Elizabeth aged. Throughout her 20s and 30s, when pressure to marry was most intense, she spoke vaguely of impediments that made marriage impossible. Foreign ambassadors and potential suitors were told that the Queen had her reasons, but those reasons were never specified. Some assumed she was simply playing political games, using the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic tool. Others wondered if there were deeper, more personal obstacles. The truth was that Elizabeth may have known from a young age that her body was different from other women's. The monthly cycles that defined female experience may have been absent or irregular. The physical changes that should have accompanied puberty may have taken unexpected forms. If she suffered from a chromosomal disorder or hormonal imbalance, as some modern historians suspect, she would have understood that marriage and childbearing were not options for her, regardless of political considerations. But rather than see this as a limitation, Elizabeth transformed it into her greatest strength. She became the Virgin Queen by necessity, then made that necessity into a virtue that defined her entire reign. She married England instead of any man, declaring herself wedded to her subjects in a ceremony of words that was more binding than any religious ritual. The physical toll of maintaining this illusion grew heavier with each passing year. The lead makeup that preserved her youthful appearance was simultaneously destroying her skin, creating deep pockmarks and patches of discoloration that required ever thicker layers to conceal. Her hair began falling out in patches, necessitating increasingly elaborate wigs. Her teeth blackened and rotted, forcing her to speak with her hand covering her mouth. Beneath her magnificent gowns, her skin developed weeping sores that refused to heal, infected by the toxic dyes in her clothing and the constant pressure of her corsets. The very substances meant to preserve her image of eternal youth were eating her alive from the outside in. She had become trapped in a cycle of toxicity, needing more poison to hide the damage caused by poison. By the 1590s, Elizabeth's public appearances had become elaborate theatrical productions requiring hours of preparation. She would spend entire mornings being dressed, painted, and wigged by teams of servants who had signed oaths of secrecy about what they witnessed. Courtiers were kept at carefully calculated distances, close enough to be impressed by the overall spectacle, but not so close as to see through the illusion. The Queen, who had once danced until dawn, now moved with careful, measured steps. The monarch, who had delivered stirring speeches with a voice that could fill great halls, now spoke in measured tones to conserve her strength. Elizabeth Tudor had become a character that Elizabeth performed, and the performance was killing the woman beneath the costume. Yet somehow, impossibly, she maintained the facade. Even as her body betrayed her, even as the poison accumulated in her organs and the corsets compressed her lungs, she continued to rule with absolute authority. She defeated the Spanish Armada, established England as a naval power, and presided over the flowering of English culture that we now call the Elizabethan age. But the cost was growing unbearable, and time was running out. The final decade of Elizabeth's life witnessed a dramatic acceleration of her physical decline, though few beyond her innermost circle would ever know the full extent of her suffering. By 1593, the Queen had begun experiencing episodes that terrified even her most loyal attendants. She would stand motionless in her chambers for hours, staring at walls as if seeing visions that existed only in her poisoned mind. Her ladies whispered of finding her speaking to people who weren't there, carrying on conversations with her long-dead mother, or childhood companions who existed only in her memories. These weren't mere eccentricities of an aging monarch. They were symptoms of severe lead poisoning, though the medical knowledge of the time couldn't identify the cause. The very cosmetics that had preserved Elizabeth's image of eternal youth were systematically destroying her brain, creating the neurological damage that would plague her final years. Her physicians, sworn to secrecy, documented treatments for what they called corruption of the royal humours, applying leeches and administering purgatives that only added to her misery. The Queen's refusal to be examined by her doctors took on new urgency as her condition worsened. She would fly into violent rages if anyone suggested removing her clothing for medical inspection, insisting that her body was sacred and inviolate. This wasn't merely royal pride or feminine modesty. Elizabeth understood that any examination would reveal the horrifying truth of what lay beneath her painted facade. Truths that could destroy not just her reign, but the entire Protestant settlement she had spent her life defending. Court records from this period, written in carefully coded language, hint at discoveries that deeply disturbed the royal physicians. One doctor, writing in Latin to obscure his meaning from casual readers, described finding aberrations of nature when treating an infection on the Queen's chest. Another mentioned anatomical configurations that challenged his understanding of divine creation. These cryptic references suggest that Elizabeth's body harbored secrets far more complex than simple illness or injury. As the 1600s dawned, the Virgin Queen had become a living corpse animated by sheer force of will. Foreign ambassadors, who glimpsed her without her usual layers of makeup, described being haunted by the sight, writing of a face covered with such deep furrows and discoloration that it barely seemed human. One Venetian diplomat confessed to having nightmares for weeks after seeing the Queen's true appearance, describing her complexion as resembling a corpse more than a living woman. The elaborate rituals surrounding Elizabeth's daily preparation had become exercises in necromancy, servants working frantically to resurrect the illusion of life from what was essentially a walking cadaver. The lead paint had to be applied in ever thicker layers to hide the advancing decay. Her wigs grew more elaborate to conceal the complete loss of her natural hair. Special garments were constructed with hidden supports and padding to maintain her iconic silhouette, even as her body withered beneath the fabric. But the most closely guarded secret of these final years was the development of what court physicians referred to in their private notes as the Great Corruption. Near Elizabeth's left breast, a mass had begun growing, starting as a small lump, but gradually expanding until it became impossible to ignore. The surrounding skin turned dark and began weeping a foul-smelling discharge that no amount of perfume could mask. The growth pulsed with its own rhythm, visible through her clothing to anyone who looked closely enough. The Queen treated this horror in absolute secrecy, changing her own bandages and applying crude remedies without consulting her physicians. She understood that any admission of serious illness would trigger a succession crisis that could plunge England into civil war. So she suffered in silence, watching her body consume itself while continuing to perform the role of divine monarch with unwavering determination. The psychological toll was perhaps even more devastating than the physical decay. Elizabeth had spent her entire adult life constructing an image of herself as something beyond mortal flesh, a virgin queen chosen by God to rule Protestant England. Now that carefully maintained illusion was collapsing from within, revealing the grotesque reality of human mortality that she had spent decades trying to transcend. Her behavior became increasingly erratic as the poisoning affected her brain. She would laugh at inappropriate moments, recoil from her own reflection, and speak of dark shapes lurking in the corners of her chambers. Sleep brought no relief, as she was tormented by nightmares filled with the faces of those she had executed, lovers she had abandoned, and children she had never born. The virgin queen who had once commanded armies now cowered before visions conjured by her own deteriorating mind. Yet even in this extremity, Elizabeth refused to yield. She continued to hold court, receive ambassadors, and make the countless decisions required to govern a kingdom. She attended council meetings wrapped in layers of silk and velvet that concealed her ravaged body, her face painted with enough lead to poison a dozen people, speaking with a voice that grew weaker each day but never lost its authority. The final crisis began in March of 1603, when Elizabeth suffered what appears to have been a massive stroke. Court records describe her collapsing during a routine audience, her right side suddenly paralyzed, foam tinged with blood pouring from her mouth. When the seizure finally ended, she lay so still that many believed she had died. Then, in a moment of terrible clarity, she whispered words that would haunt those who heard them for the rest of their lives. What she said in that moment has never been officially recorded, but fragments survived in private letters and coded diplomatic dispatches. Some accounts suggest she spoke of being bound by chains of iron around her neck, trapped in a body that had become her prison. Others hint at more disturbing confessions, admissions about her true nature that were so shocking they were immediately suppressed. The few witnesses were sworn to absolute secrecy, and several were quietly transferred to remote posts or simply disappeared from the historical record entirely. The Queen's final days were spent in a twilight state between life and death, her body failing, but her mind occasionally surfacing with moments of startling lucidity. She refused to lie down, insisting that death would claim her if she showed any sign of weakness. Instead, she stood propped against cushions, her skeletal frame draped in royal robes, her painted face a grotesque mask that fooled no one who saw it up close. Her last coherent words were reportedly spoken to Robert Cecil, her most trusted advisor, in the early hours of March 24th. Witnesses later claimed she spoke of secrets that must die with her, of truths too dangerous for England to bear. She begged him to ensure that her body would never be examined, that certain discoveries must remain hidden forever. Cecil, understanding the implications, swore the oath that would seal Elizabeth's secrets for eternity. When death finally came at 3 a.m, it was not the peaceful passing of a Christian soul, but the violent expulsion of something that had clung to life with supernatural determination. Those present described her body convulsing in ways that seemed to defy natural law, her skin moving as if something crawled beneath it, strange sounds emanating from within her chest that resembled nothing human. The moment her breathing stopped, the machinery of concealment sprang into action. The chamber was immediately sealed, all witnesses sworn to silence under penalty of death. The body was wrapped in multiple layers of silk before rigor mortis could set in, then placed in a specially constructed lead coffin that was soldered shut without delay. No death mask was made, no public viewing permitted, No opportunity for anyone to see what the Virgin Queen had truly become. But 3 men had already seen everything, and what they discovered in those final moments would challenge everything England believed about its greatest monarch. The preparation of her body revealed secrets so profound, so politically explosive, that they would remain buried for over 4 centuries, sealed beneath Westminster Abbey where they rest still, protected by silence and the understanding that some truths are too dangerous for any nation to confront. The Virgin Queen was dead, but the mystery of who she really was had only just begun. The removal of Elizabeth's elaborate costume began with trembling hands and whispered prayers. What those 3 sworn witnesses encountered defied every expectation they had held about their beloved sovereign. As layers of silk and velvet fell away, as the whalebone corsets were carefully cut from flesh they had moulded for decades, the true cost of Elizabeth's transformation became horrifyingly clear. Her spine curved unnaturally, twisted by years of rigid posture and crushing garments into a shape that barely resembled human anatomy. Individual vertebrae pressed against paper-thin skin, creating ridges and valleys where none should exist. The muscles along her back had atrophied completely, leaving nothing but bone draped in flesh that resembled ancient parchment more than living tissue. But it was the removal of her famous white makeup that truly shattered the illusion. The Venetian cerris peeled away in strips like old paint, revealing skin underneath that bore no resemblance to the porcelain complexion immortalized in countless portraits. Dark patches bloomed across her face like spreading ink stains. Blisters had formed and burst, leaving craters that wept blood and pus. In some places, the flesh had hardened to leather. In others, it had turned black with necrosis. The lead had done its work with methodical precision, eating through her skin cell by poison cell until what remained was barely recognizable as human. Her hairline had receded almost to the crown of her skull, exposing sores and lesions that had been hidden beneath rouge and powder for years. The attendants stared in horror at what the Virgin Queen had become in her desperate attempt to remain forever young. Yet even these discoveries paled beside what they found when they examined her torso. Near her left breast, exactly where court physicians had noted mysterious swellings in their coded reports, lay a mass the size of a goose egg. It was dark purple, almost black, with veins that seemed to pulse independently of any heartbeat. When one of the attendants pressed against it, black blood seeped from its surface, filling the chamber with a metallic stench that made grown men retch. The growth appeared to contain structures that defied medical understanding. Hair and what looked like teeth were visible beneath the translucent skin that covered it. Some modern historians would later speculate that this was a teratoma, a type of tumor that can contain multiple tissue types. But to 17th century eyes, it appeared demonic, a monster that had been growing inside their queen for years. The examination of her internal organs revealed devastation that went beyond simple disease. Her liver had hardened to the consistency of stone, shriveled and blackened beyond recognition. Her kidneys were similarly ruined, brittle as old parchment and completely non-functional. When they opened her abdomen, a sharp chemical odor filled the air, metallic and stinging, unlike anything associated with natural death. Near the base of her spine pooled a thick, dark fluid, unlike any substance they had encountered. It clung to their instruments like tar, resisting every attempt to clean it away. They had no name for this corruption, calling it simply the rot within. Modern science would recognize it as the accumulated toxins from decades of lead poisoning. But to these men it seemed like evidence of something far more sinister. The most disturbing discovery, however, lay in her reproductive anatomy. The organs that should have defined her as a woman were so altered as to be nearly unrecognizable. Her uterus had shriveled to the size and consistency of a dried plum, covered with calcifications that resembled barnacles. The surrounding tissue showed signs of severe hormonal disruption, suggesting conditions that would have made normal female development impossible. But it was the external examination that revealed the secret Elizabeth had guarded most carefully throughout her reign. The anatomical structures that should have clearly defined her sex were ambiguous at best, possibly indicating a chromosomal disorder that affected sexual development. The discovery raised immediate questions about everything from her legitimacy to rule to the very nature of the person who had governed England for 45 years. These findings aligned disturbingly with persistent rumours that had circulated throughout Elizabeth's reign. Whispers about her unusual height, broad shoulders, and deep voice had followed her for decades. Foreign ambassadors had commented privately on her masculine bearing and stride. Her refusal to marry, once attributed to political calculation, took on new meaning in light of what lay before these shocked witnesses. The implications were staggering. If Elizabeth had indeed been born with ambiguous sexual characteristics, it would explain not only her virginity, but her entire approach to ruling. She had transformed what could have been seen as divine curse into the foundation of her political power, becoming the Virgin Queen not by choice, but by biological necessity. More troubling still were the skeletal abnormalities they discovered. Her bone structure showed signs of conditions that modern medicine might recognize as genetic disorders affecting sexual development. The broad chest, narrow pelvis, and elongated limbs that had given her such commanding presence might have been symptoms of chromosomal variations that would have been completely unknown to Tudor physicians. The examination also revealed evidence of chronic medical conditions that Elizabeth had hidden throughout her reign. Severe arthritis had fused many of her joints, explaining the careful, measured movements that courtiers had attributed to royal dignity. Her skull showed signs of the neurological damage that lead poisoning can cause, with areas of bone that had softened and warped under toxic assault. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the modifications to her body that appeared to have been made deliberately. Scar tissue suggested surgical interventions performed in secret, possibly to address the anatomical ambiguities they were discovering. Someone, whether Elizabeth herself or trusted physicians, had attempted to alter her physical form to better fit societal expectations of femininity. The three witnesses faced an impossible decision as they stared at the evidence before them. Revealing these discoveries would destroy not just Elizabeth's reputation, but potentially the entire Protestant settlement that had defined English religious identity for half a century. Catholic enemies would seize upon any suggestion that the Virgin Queen had been cursed by God, using it as proof that Protestant rule was illegitimate. More immediately, such revelations could trigger a succession crisis that might plunge England into civil war. James of Scotland's claim to the throne was already being questioned by some nobles. Adding doubts about Elizabeth's very identity to these political tensions could prove catastrophic for the kingdom's stability. The decision was made in whispered consultation between the three men. Everything they had witnessed would be sealed away forever. The body was wrapped in multiple layers of silk, placed in a lead coffin that was immediately soldered shut, then encased in another wooden coffin wrapped with iron chains. No detail of their discoveries would ever appear in any official record. The cleanup was systematic and thorough. Every instrument that had touched the Queen's body was destroyed. The table where the examination had taken place was burned. Even the floor where her blood had fallen was scrubbed clean and the stones replaced. The three witnesses were separated immediately after the procedure, forbidden from meeting or corresponding with each other ever again. Dr. Richard Manningham was quietly transferred to Scotland under an assumed identity, spending his remaining years treating plague victims in remote villages. Lady Helena Snakenborg entered a convent with a strict vow of silence, never speaking again of what she had witnessed. The unnamed minister simply vanished from historical records entirely, his fate unknown, but his silence assured. The official account of Elizabeth's death was sanitized beyond recognition. She had passed peacefully after a brief illness, her body showing only the normal effects of advanced age. There was no mention of deformities, no reference to the anatomical anomalies, no hint of the horror that had been discovered and then deliberately erased from history. Yet fragments of truth survived despite these efforts. Lady Snarkenborg's encrypted journal, discovered and decoded only in the 20th century, contained cryptic references to seeing not the body of their late queen, but something that had worn her shape. Dr. Manningham's medical writings, preserved in Scottish archives, included oblique references to conditions that should not exist in God's creation. The unnamed minister left only a single piece of evidence, a note written in the margins of his Bible that was discovered centuries later. The words were brief but haunting. "I have seen proof that devils can wear crowns. God forgive us for what we have hidden." These scattered testimonies, dismissed by most historians as fantasy or metaphor, take on new significance when examined alongside the extraordinary measures taken to seal Elizabeth's tomb. Her burial site remains unique among English monarchs, reinforced with multiple layers of lead and stone, marked with religious symbols meant to contain whatever lies within. The refusal of modern authorities to permit any scientific examination of her remains speaks to the enduring power of the secret those three men discovered. DNA testing could resolve questions about chromosomal disorders. Chemical analysis could confirm the extent of lead poisoning. Forensic examination could verify the anatomical anomalies described in fragmentary accounts. But such revelations would challenge fundamental assumptions about one of history's most celebrated monarchs. Elizabeth Tudor has become more than a historical figure. She represents the triumph of will over circumstance, the possibility of transcending biological limitations through sheer force of character. To suggest that her greatest achievements were built upon deception, that her virgin state was necessity rather than choice, would undermine myths that have shaped English identity for centuries. The secret that changed history lies not just in what Elizabeth was, but in what she chose to become, despite the constraints of her physical reality. Whether born with chromosomal variations, genetic disorders, or simply the victim of toxic beauty regimens, she transformed potential weakness into unprecedented strength. She ruled not as the woman she was born to be, but as the monarch she willed herself to become. The Virgin Queen's greatest victory was not over Spanish armadas or Catholic conspiracies, but over the limitations of her own flesh. She conquered mortality itself through the power of performance, creating an image so compelling that it survived even the horrifying reality of what lay beneath. Her body may have been a battlefield of disease, deformity, and decay, but her myth achieved the immortality that her flesh could never possess. Today, as tourists file past her tomb in Westminster Abbey, they honour not just a historical figure, but a masterpiece of self-creation. The woman who declared herself married to England succeeded in making that union eternal, binding her identity so completely to the nation that questioning one requires questioning the other. The secret remains sealed beneath layers of lead, stone, and deliberate ignorance, because some truths are too dangerous for nations to confront. Elizabeth understood this better than anyone, sacrificing her body to preserve her image, trading physical authenticity for political immortality. In death, as in life, she controls the narrative, ensuring that the Virgin Queen's final secret remains forever beyond the reach of those who would disturb her carefully constructed legend. Her carefully constructed legend. The truth about Elizabeth Tudor's body tells us something profound about power itself and the prices we pay to maintain it. Here was a woman who understood that ruling meant more than issuing commands or winning battles. It meant becoming a symbol so powerful that reality itself bent around it. She sacrificed her flesh to create something eternal, something that could outlast any mortal form. But the cost was staggering. Every morning for decades, Elizabeth submitted to a ritual of transformation that was slowly killing her. The lead paint that preserved her image of divine beauty was accumulating in her organs, poisoning her blood, eating away at her brain tissue. The corsets that created her iconic silhouette were crushing her ribs, displacing her internal organs, restricting her breathing. The elaborate gowns that projected majesty were hiding a body that was failing catastrophically, yet she persevered because she understood something that few rulers ever grasp. The monarchy was not about her personal comfort or even her personal survival. It was about maintaining an illusion that kept a nation stable, a Protestant church legitimate, and an empire expanding. Elizabeth Tudor, the woman, could suffer and die, but Elizabeth Tudor, the Virgin Queen, had to remain perfect forever. The medical evidence we can piece together from surviving fragments paints a picture of extraordinary endurance in the face of unimaginable pain. Her physicians documented treatments for conditions they couldn't identify, symptoms they had never encountered before. Modern analysis of her surviving cosmetics reveals lead concentrations that would be immediately fatal if ingested. Yet she applied these toxins to her skin daily for 40 years. The skeletal deformities found during her secret examination suggest someone whose body was being systematically reshaped by the demands of royal presentation. The compression of her spine, the displacement of her organs, the artificial modification of her natural form, all point to a monarch who literally rebuilt herself to fit the requirements of her role. What makes Elizabeth's story even more remarkable is that she appears to have understood the full cost of her choices and made them anyway. Private letters hint at moments of despair, times when the pain became almost unbearable. Yet she never wavered in her commitment to the performance that defined her reign. She chose myth over mortality, symbol over self, legacy over life. The conspiracy of silence that followed her death reveals how completely she had succeeded in this transformation. The three men who witnessed her true condition understood immediately that what they had seen could never be revealed. Not because it would damage Elizabeth's reputation, but because it would destroy the very concept of divine monarchy that held England together. Think about what this means for our understanding of power and leadership. Elizabeth ruled for 45 years, not despite her physical limitations, but because of how she transformed them into sources of strength. Her inability to marry became the foundation of her independence. Her unusual anatomy became proof of her divine nature. Her slow poisoning by toxic cosmetics became evidence of her otherworldly beauty. This is perhaps the most profound lesson of the Virgin Queen's secret. True power comes not from perfection, but from the ability to control how imperfection is perceived. Elizabeth took everything that could have been seen as weakness and reframed it as strength. She turned biological necessity into political choice, medical condition into religious symbolism, personal suffering into national triumph. The modern world still struggles with these same tensions between public image and private reality. Leaders today face constant scrutiny, their every flaw magnified and dissected by media that would have been unimaginable in Elizabeth's time. Yet few have shown her mastery of narrative control, her understanding that perception shapes reality more than facts ever could. Consider how different England's history might have been if Elizabeth's secrets had been revealed during her lifetime. The Spanish Armada might have succeeded if Philip had known the Virgin Queen was slowly dying from self-inflicted poisoning. Catholic conspirators might have found more support if they could have proven that Protestant England was ruled by someone whose very body challenged conventional understanding of divine favour. But Elizabeth's genius lay in ensuring that such revelations could never emerge. She controlled every aspect of her presentation with obsessive precision. She chose her attendants for their loyalty rather than their skill. She compartmentalized information so completely that no single person understood the full extent of her condition. She built redundant systems of concealment that operated even after her death. The three witnesses who prepared her body for burial were not chosen randomly. They were selected specifically because they understood the stakes involved. Dr. Manningham had served the crown for decades and knew that revealing royal secrets meant certain death. Lady Snakenborg came from a family whose fortunes depended entirely on royal favour. The unnamed minister had sworn religious oaths that bound him to secrecy, regardless of what he might discover. Yet even these precautions might not have been enough if the discoveries had been less shocking. The fact that all three men immediately agreed to complete silence suggests that what they found challenged their most fundamental assumptions about nature, divinity, and monarchy itself. They were not simply hiding evidence of illness or deformity, but confronting something that threatened the very foundations of their worldview. The Virgin Queen's tomb in Westminster Abbey stands as more than a monument to England's greatest monarch. It is a fortress protecting the most dangerous secret in British history. A truth so profound that it has reshaped our understanding of power itself. Elizabeth Tudor proved that reality is less important than the story we tell about it, that flesh can be sacrificed for legend, and that sometimes the greatest victories require the ultimate deception. Her secret remains sealed because some myths are too powerful to destroy, some truths too dangerous to reveal, and some queens too essential to their nation's identity to ever truly die.